Well, I'm from Ahamore, the village of Ahamore, and this is where we're sitting now. This is the uptown part of the village.
Starbucks.
The other is the downtown. And I was born and reared here in the village. It's also a parish. Ahamore is also a parish. So there's a townland within in the parish called Ahamore, and this is where we are now. And the part of the village, what's known as the village of Ahamore then, is actually part of it is in, like everything in Ireland, it's interesting and it's complex, is Killian or Coigulasis across the road. You'd often find that you'd have one side of the road would be, sometimes a road would be the boundary between townlands.
When you say a road, is the road I'm after driving?
That's right. As you came through the village, the houses on the right hand side, including the school across the road there and the Glorn and Oak Creche and everything, they're all in Killian. But we're on the Ahamore side.
Oh, right.
And you'd often find that if a road was the boundary, like this is upland you see, and this here is Ahamore. Acha is, of course, an upland grazing field, usually, or it could be tillage, but usually grazing field. And it's interesting that Monaghan McGann, the great traveller and the great travelogue writer and Gaelgore in Untitled Chapter and RT, has a lovely book now out called 32 Names for Field. And it's investigating all about Ireland and our background, going back 9,000 years. But he's using lots of terms that are so interesting. And because cattle were so huge in Ireland and
Very
farming.
important. Sign the money. Yes, cattle were wealth.
This is it, yeah. So we're part of the Indo-European languages, and the many of the words and a lot of the customs and stuff can be traced back to the Indus Valley and to India itself. Like say, that's it. Subsequently, then the steppes. But say like the Braham now is the big Indian Gora. Well, in Ireland, he was the Brev, you know. And the cow, of course, was huge in their culture, and cows and cattle caused awful trouble.
But why did they take on the persona of wealth then? Like, was it because of their meat, milk, leather, or was it something else?
There are loads of reasons for that, and Monica McGann explains it much better than I can.
Right,
but like, cow was very, very valuable, yeah, and you have like loads of place names. Like I started off with Acher, which was a hill grazing place. Now a Booley then was a higher hill grazing place where they usually had a clocher or a clochon. You'd have a circular stone area for holding the sheep or goats or cattle and milking them and so on. But it's part of our culture, so that comes into the Ahamore segment. Like you'd have Inishbofina then would be the island of the fair cow and so on. But you have loads of mythology in that related to cows and that kind of stuff.
Why isn't Killian, as you're driving into the village, there's a big stone with Ahamore written on it? Where does Killian come into that?
Well, there's a lovely point. You had some townlands that were kind of under the shadow of the other one, you know. I suppose Ahamore, because it was named after the parish was named after it as well, or it was named after the parish, that gave it a bit of status.
A bit of status.
Yeah, but really they're very much the same terrain.
No, it's nearly the same.
Terrain and everything, yeah, of course. Yeah, but
so,
it's fascinating like that the Ahamore Church, this happens in many towns especially, the Ahamore Church, St. Joseph's Church Ahamore actually is in the townland of Killian or Coigulasis, as I mentioned. And place names are fascinating too. For years we thought Killian meant a small graveyard, and they were usually associated with a church, an ancient little kill or church or dwelling place for a monk. But it was only when we found, of all things, some landlord records that we found it was actually spelled as Colleen. So therefore it really meant the small wood. So all our efforts to be searching for this monastic site, and we had a historical project here in the parish in the 1990 and 1991, and they were going back and over every field. No.
But did you find the small wood?
No, the wood of course had been cut, it was long gone, you know. But it's fascinating, it's absolutely
And how far back? Like we'll drift a small bit away from your own, but how old is this village?
Well, that's an interesting point. The village of Ahamore would a number of houses would certainly be dating back to the early 1800s anyway. And the first, the church was built in the village in 1832. Should have been built in 1831. They were all built really and completed a year after emancipation was passed in 1830. And it's a fascinating story as well, like everything, why it wasn't built. And the summary of it is that the local landlord who was Moore O'Farrell, who were Roman Catholic landlords and who were up in Kildare, he had got this townland, his grandfather had, and another townland called Cummer down in the far end of our parish, close to the lake, a very, very marshy area. He had got, when he got married, this great-grandfather of Moore O'Farrell, he had, his daughter was given 2 townlands in dowry. She was Dylan, his wife rather, and those are 2 of the ones she got from Ahmore parish, and she got 2 more then from Bacon parish and so on as her dowry. So rent was being paid to him all the time up in the Sheikh Mohammed is there now in that place in Kildare. So Ahmore has a connection with that.
You're posh.
Sheikh Mohammed.
Funny you mentioned emancipation. Basically, all the churches in rural Ireland were built after that.
Most of them were built after 1829. Well, it was passed in 1829, but it came into law in 1830. But the reason I know why it wasn't finished in Ahmore in 1831, like every other place, or 1830, was that the Catholic landlord was refusing to give them a site. He had a dispute with the church, obviously, and all that was needed was an acre. But they pulled a good one. The next townland over here of all things is called Cornegirta. Cor is usually, it can mean many things, battles and stuff, but usually it's a hill. And Negirta would be Plough Hill, really, that would be the name of it. But Plough Hill is a small town in Cornegirta, but the landlord there was from outside Hollymount, and he was a Church of Ireland, or he was a Protestant. And he offered them a site immediately, seeing the advantage. And they had dug the foundations and they had built a holding tank for water in that town, and just about 100 metres or more from where we're sitting now. But when the parish priest of the day in Ahmore saw this, he relented and he gave them the piece of ground. And there was no Protestants at all in this parish, but that didn't stop them from having to pay the tithes to the Protestants all the time. That was there never was any facility here or any church or anything of the kind, but they still had to play up and look pleasant. And of course the wars of the tithes were shocking, the different wars that went on. But to return to the church in Ahmore, after it was built then in 1832, they waited until the autumn of 1832 to open it, and the landlord arrived down from Kildare, from Kildangan Castle in Kildare. And he arrived down, and great ceremonial, and he was dined and wined by the priests and everything, and no mention was made at all of that. And only for that site had been built there, and David Byrne, a namesake of my own, who knew the story of that, and then her son later. And my father was a flute player and a whistle player and a step dancer, and singing odd verse, but never much out publicly, but he'd be humming and whistling as well. And my grandfather, James Byrne, my father's name was Joe Byrne, and my grandfather's name was James Byrne, and he was a flute player as well and a step dancer too. But it's interesting that they never danced together. They often played together, but they never could agree to dance together. And it's fascinating because my grandfather had a kind of an open-ended Shannon style of dancing, apparently. And as my father put it, like he'd be making up steps and capering round, and his hands going, and he'd let a bit of an odd shout out of them and stuff, And my father belonged to the school of dance of a man called John Toohey. Now the Tooheys were dance masters in this East Mayo area from the 1700s, and there was supposed to be 5 generations of them. And the Toohey dance masters survived into the early 1960s, and the last one was in Foxford and went to England then, and that was the end of it. But they had a glorious tradition, but John Toohey was exceptionally brilliant dancer, the grandfather of the man who went to England. And John Toohey taught dance all over. And he taught dance when my father was a small boy, a young boy. He taught dance in a small little house called, it's just when you turn off beyond at the corner of Bruff Cross, and you're on the N17, and you come off for Ahmore here. Yeah. Well, when you come round a very sharp bend, about maybe 50 metres after that, there's a little ruin of a house there, and it was Winnie Meehan's, and it was in that house that he spent I think 2 weeks teaching dance. It would be usually 1 week or 2. I think it was 2. And my father and quite a number of younger people from the area who were young at that time, the early 1900s, they learned dance from him. And he had a very specific approach, standing up straight and beautiful steps and lovely double, treble steps in the hornpipe and all that kind of stuff. But they got on well for the 2 weeks they were there. My father wasn't the best pupil by any means, but he was handy enough. Jim Conboy now in the village, Michael Conboy, the flute player's father, was exceptionally good. But my father's brother then later on, James Byrne, he was a very good step dancer. But they were learning the procedure was universal. It meant that during the week the teacher would be teaching the children to dance and maybe a few of the early teenagers, and he'd get a penny a night from each of them or whatever it was, 2p maybe if he could, but that would just kind of keep him going. But then each Sunday night they would have a general spree, and there would be a small charge. Well, they go around with a cap, but everyone was expected to put in something to help the dance master, you see. And on the Sunday night. So on the Sunday night, then he'd get a good few shillings, maybe. And that's a few shillings out of the different coppers that we brought in. And there would be a dance all night on the Sunday night. And what would happen would be, in the evening, the children would come in to dance. This was quite common with dance masters everywhere. The children who had learned their steps would come in, and then some of the older teenagers would come in, and then they had learned their steps. And of course, virtually hardly any women at all were dancing at that time. It was almost all men, Very unusual. Where the wheel went totally full circle in my time as a young fellow. It became a girling's thing to be dancing. But and in any event, the first week went well, I think, and they had a great spree. And there was a good crowd at it, and of course word spread about it. So the second week went really well, and father was going back and over. It was a nice little walk from here, maybe about a kilometre and a half or so. But in the middle of it all, there were people inside and out and everywhere, and they heard the sound of horses' hoofs coming galloping mad from a moor. And there was a priest here called Long Father Walsh, and he jumped down off the horse with the whip, and he took the back door. He came the Coigulasis side of them by surprise. And he flaked all around. He flaked all around them, and they scattered. And Tui never did return to that particular house. But there was one brilliant pupil who was very well known, who was in Winnie Meehan's little house, and who had just left that night when the Soggers arrived. But he was there for a week. He hadn't done the first week. He did the second week. And he's the man that dances the fastest reel in the world. It's on the Late Late Show. And his name is Johnny Keneally, and he's from the parish of Ahamore, a place called Clonfalach, where there was a post office actually. His people had a post office there. And he was carried over every night as a small boy to Tui. And he was a really neat dancer. And he was so good at the age of, we say, 4 or 5 or whatever he was at the time, maybe 6. And Tui, he used to be sitting above on the dresser, watching the dancers down below because there was no room. And sometimes when pupils would be having a difficulty with a step, they'd call on, he'd try and teach them, and Tui would help them along. Tui might have to call and say, "Wee Johnny, come down here," and show them how to do it. He was that good. He had learned it without being taught it at all. And he himself became a dance master subsequently. Now, just while we're on about dance, there's another very interesting connection with dance as well, and John Tui in the same way. Round the very same time, there was another man, John Tui, had other pupils. Johnny Keneally became one of the most famous of them in terms of public dancing performances, and also as being a dance master himself. Like he went as far up as Holly Mountain places to teach dance, and he'd spend a week there and a week, following on in the tradition of Tui, even more so than Tui's own sons. But there was another man then who was a very, very handy dancer, who was a pupil of Tui's, and he was Ivers, Johnny Ivers. Johnny Ivers was from between Coigulasis and Hamore, and Johnny, a relation of Eileen Ivers, of course, and she's a descendant of his. And Johnny was a very good step dancer. And it's interesting that just within a small geographical area, Johnny was teaching one time for a winter again, even though he lived only about 2 miles away from there, but he stayed there. He was teaching in a townland called Kilhun, which is just on the border of Ahamore on one side, Coigulasis parish on the other side, and it's actually in the parish of Knock. And he was in that house, and there was great music in that house. And in a few houses in Kilhorn, there were great box players. There was a famous one called Nora Tolan. And she was a great melodeon player. She played in New York for many years. She came home and played with the New York Kelly Band in 1960 when they played in Boyle. And then a relation of hers distantly called Breda Tolan, who's still alive, thank God. She was the very first Mayo person to win an All-Ireland accordion title under 18 in about 1950s, early 50s, 52 or 3, maybe 54. And she was one of the very first also in this area to change over to double row. And she did it herself without being taught, which was most interesting. So that's just to give you an idea of Kilhorn, just a little flavour of Kilhorn. And he was in the house anyway, and he had one very, very good pupil. Ivers, there'd always been one outstanding one, and her name was Maisie McNicholas. And Maisie would be the queen who would dance on the Sunday night as well, especially. And she had learned enormous amount of steps, and he had done a few winters there. And eventually Maisie McNicholas emigrated to America. And Johnny Ivers discontinued the dance, like them all. It petered out in the 1960s, the dance masters and that. Some began to go to schools then, but the older ones didn't. And anyway, she married in America. She was married in New York to a fellow called Cognan from Coigulasis. Cognan is quite a common name in Coigulasis, which is in the parish of Hamor. Archbishop Cognan, Joseph Cognan of Tuam, was from here. And she married in America, and her son was an outstanding dancer. His name was John Cognan. And he was winning fishes before him and behind him and after him. And he was in the All-American on a number of occasions. And the man that he used to defeat in several of those was Michael Flatley.
No.
So there was this beautiful business that Eileen Ivers was the lead fiddle player with Riverdance, and that it was her granduncle or step or whatever, relation anyway, Johnny Ivers, who had taught Maisie McNicholas the music and the dance, and then she loved the dance, and her son then went to a dance teacher in America, and Maisie was able to help him as well with some lovely steps, and he was able to beat Flatley, who was the lead dancer. And then that brings me around to the other lead dancer in Riverdance, of course, was Jean Butler. And Jean Butler's mother, of course, is Josephine Byrne from Derrymore. And my grandfather, James Byrne, married in here from Knock. He married into Hamor, to Lavins. And his brother, my grandfather's brother, married in Derrymore, in a farm there. And they were brothers. And her grandfather was Dominic Byrne. And there was this lovely idea that Riverdance, the three principal people involved in it were all from East Mayo. Now, not quite all, because Eileen Ivers' of course, mother is from Benmullet. So you had this beautiful Mayo connection. Like it was just, it's just lovely, really. It's really, really special. I'll go back to my father, and my father was a flute player and a whistle player and a step dancer, as I said, indeed, home English. And when I meet with you again, I'll do a number of little tunes that come down from my father, and some interesting ones and interesting versions of tunes and stuff. Nothing magical or astounding, but very, very interesting. But when we were younger, it was quite straightforward. My father would sit us on his knee, and he would blow. He would finger the whistle. It was always a Clark whistle at that time, and we would blow into it. Every one of us in turn were able to play a few tunes in that way. And the first little jig that he taught us all was this little jig. And that's exactly the way that he would play that tune. And it's interesting the way that the approach that he had. He never learned any of the new tunes at all that were coming out. Like he never played the Sally Gardens or any of those tunes that were coming to the fore. He just completely ignored them. And he just had a nice little core of tunes that were older. And I'll play a cross-section of them for you the next time you're here, no problem whatsoever.
We'll do it on the
But
document.
getting back to...
But your family...
getting back to my father, and his mother was a melodeon player as well. She was Bridget Lavin, and she was a step dancer. And she was from this farm here, and my grandfather James Byrne married in here. He was a flute player and a step dancer. And Bridget, when they started going to Tui to learn to dance, she stopped teaching them her steps, and my grandfather never taught them any of his steps either. They went with Tui, and everyone in the whole place did. It was like moving over the double row accordion, shall we say?
Big.
Yeah. And the tune she used to hum for them, because she'd be getting them to shape and stuff. If she was playing the melodeon, she wouldn't be able to have control over them. So she'd stand them up, the three of them. There were three brothers in it. And Patrick and James and Joe was my father. And the two tunes she used to use primarily were the Maid Behind the Bar and particularly Miss Monaghan. And the way she had to get them to even start off, she'd play the low part first, just say once, which was the proper thing to do. And when she'd come to the end of that, so they'd know when to get started, she'd go, she'd always go with that, you see. So my father would just be smiling about that, and he'd be humming, particularly Miss Monaghan to himself, and then he'd do that for the fun, and he'd do a bit of a winking, because so instead of bowing to them, she'd be standing with them, so she wouldn't be facing them, she'd be standing side by side with them, getting to straighten themselves up and to dance, you know. And so she was quite influential. My grandfather then was an interesting flute player, that his father as well, my great grandfather Dominic Byrne, was a flute player too. And it's interesting that the sprees and stuff that he used to play were seriously affected because the pioneer movement came in at that time in the 1830s, and they had an enormous impact on cutting down on the music, and then of course the Great Famine came along, which was shocking. But my grandfather then was in England in the 1880s, and they began to throw away the old flutes that were being used by the orchestra, that were called the wooden flutes, that were being discarded. And they were introducing half wooden and half metal ones and totally metal ones with keys, because they were much more accurate and they were more accessible for the orchestra and so on. So a huge amount of flutes that had been used in flute bands and in orchestras and in theatre bands and all that were discarded. So flutes became available, but yet they were quite dear to get a fairly good one. So there's a lovely tale about my grandfather's flute, which I still have. And he was over at working for farmers, of course, on seasonal work. And they were upriver in the Humbert. Now, the Humbert River in England the Humber River in England is a very big river. There are, in fact, I think 7 rivers, the Yorkshire Ouse and the Great Ouse, and they come down to the sea at Hull, where it's very wide indeed and very boggy too. But they would be upstream when they'd be doing the hay, probably, and the oats, and then for the potatoes they were down in Lincolnshire further down. But whatever about it, there was a swimming competition across the Humber River, back and over at one point. And it was set up, and the prize was £5. And my grandfather, very few people learned to swim in the old days, because there was this theory that if you were a fisherman, you were better to drown when the accident came. There was a theory then in bogland like East Mayo here that there was no bottom to the lakes. So it looked lovely to hop into a lake and you could paddle around and flounder around in it. And, you could be buck lamely and all that. But they believed that because of the bogness, suddenly it could go from under you and you'd be swallowed up. You had this theory. So they were forbidden to be swimming. But there was a lake across from where my grandfather was born. His born in a place called Booley Row, which is in the parish of Knock. And when they gone to Mass, the parents gone to Mass on the Sunday, he had 3 other brothers, and they went out swimming, and all the neighbours. So all the lads learned to swim. Of course, the girls weren't given any. So he was fairly handy at it. Anyway, the upshot was that there was this competition, and he managed to win it and got the £5. And he went down into, I think it was down into Hull later, and bought the flute for the £5. And it was they were all in good nick because they had been put aside and had only been used slightly.
But before this, even the early 1800s, what were they using as flutes? They
were using all the wooden ones. And if you look at any of the medieval instruments, you'll see those. You have loads of them you have the concert of St. Sepulchre and all these different concerts. and bands, old style bands like that, you know. But that's just to give an indication. But when they would be playing the flutes together, yeah, they'd play the flutes fine together, but they would never agree to dance together because of the contrast in styles. Yeah, it shows you how things evolve and change all the time.
And was one seen as old-fashioned and not cool?
Oh yeah, that was it. You see that?
Stuff.
Yeah, that was the bog version, you know. And
this is the classic.
You see, there was always that in it. There was always the love-hate thing, even with the travelling musicians as well. One cohort of the population loved them to see them coming in. They were brilliant. Others thought they were no better than beggars or tramps, like, you know. But it's a fascinating scenario, and of course my grandmother played the melodeon was so typical in that the melodeon took over hugely in the late 1890s, the early 1900s in this part of the world. And before that, the flute, as I said, with my great-grandfather going back to the 1830s, the flute was very popular, as was the fiddle too. And you had 2 blind fiddle players in the 1800s in this parish. And you had 3 uilleann pipers in the 1800s. The last of the uilleann pipers died in 1884. And it's amazing how his name was Caulfield, and we didn't even know what his first name was. He was always called Piper Caulfield, and we knew there's a number of interesting tunes, unusual tunes, especially tunes that you'd hear in the north, because the Caulfields were originally from Castle Caulfield in County Tyrone, that part of Tyrone. But obviously they had come to Armagh, to Coigulasis, back in the 1700s, and with all the clearances and stuff. It was never clear where they came from, which part, but it's the crowd in the Caulfields in Kilmavie knew where they came from, but I'm not sure about the ones here. But anyway, what's fascinating is we have a number of lovely little tunes that they skipped over Donegal, and they skipped over Leitrim, and skipped over Sligo. They're right here in East Mayo. And when the piping tradition ceased, as it did, as I mentioned, with Piper Caulfield, Patrick Caulfield, Michael Kelly, a great historian that uncovered a lot of information about Piper Caulfield. Factually now, there a couple of years ago, and he's written a brilliant article about him. But when he died then, the tunes lived on in the melodeon. And you'd be very surprised to think like that piping tunes would live on in the melodeon, but they did. And we have a lovely thing at the moment now where Jerry O'Sullivan, the great Mayo, New York uilleann piper, is working on that kind of thing. And he has been bringing back the melodeon tunes of Coigulasis onto the pipes, and the melodeon tunes where Ella Morris Rowe is from as well, down there in Swinford, behind the road into Swinford, and Shamrock and Kilkelly, and also the Johnny Henry tunes, which, you know, so many of them are piping tunes, the old tunes that came from the bog piper down there, Paddy Shaw and Nancy Hunt, you know.
Yeah.
You see, you had noble and wealthy pipers, you had gentleman pipers, like in Carricastle, they had 3 or 4 pipers as well. They had one gentleman piper who was MacDonald, and descendant of the MacDonalds, and he actually was an MP for a short while in the House of Commons. But he had 2 sets of pipes, one massive one that's colossal altogether. He was a huge man, which are in the museum in Dublin, and he had another set that went to his cousin Lord MacDonald, who of Swinford, and I forget where they ended up now. But
you mentioned the difference.
The bog piper lived in a hole in the bog. Johnny, and it's a great thing how no tune has come down from MacDonald, even though he's mentioned in folklore because he was such a larger-than-life character, and he represented Mayo East during the famine. But it's fascinating.
And why was this character difference in the pipers? Like you have the courtly piper and the bog piper, and why was there this kind of character difference, or kind of like it's nearly like a personality trait or a personality difference, or a character difference? Like why was one courtly and one?
I don't know, to be honest with you, David, but I do think that, you know, a lot of the bigger houses, especially of the Catholic nobility, were patrons of the harpers first, and all that, and subsequently then they became patrons of pipers and all that. Like, for example, we have the lovely tradition here of O'Carolan and Hamor too, and that O'Carolan came to the Dillons of Mannon, who were Roman Catholic landlords, and who owned about 10 or 12 townlands here in Hamor, and their house is still up there in Mannon. But in any event, O'Carolan composed 4 tunes there, and it's interesting that the very first book of music that was ever published in the 1820s was published by John and William Neal in Fishamble Street in Dublin. And there are 3 tunes from that collection, that were composed in a Hamor here, of O'Carolyn's. And they're hardly ever played now. The 4th tune is played fairly often, Lady Dillon. But the first one that's in the book there is James Beattie. And James Beattie married the lady of the house there when the Mayo dynasty died out. The next tune in it is Frances Dillon. She was the lady of the house, the young lady of the house who married James Beattie. And the next tune then is Gerald Dillon. He was the old buck. And there's a tune. And there are also Irish verses to go along with this outlandish praise, praising them and so on. And then Lady Dillon was the lady of the house there as well.
And who did you say wrote these?
O'Carolyn. So O'Carolyn was here in the late 1600s, the early 1700s. And then in the first book that was ever published in 1724 or 28, those 3 tunes incredibly. That's to say, published for traditional music, Irish music, for oboe and something, and fiddle, I think. But they were the first ones specifically put out for traditional music.
And who'd have written the text? You said those outlandish texts.
Loads of the texts have been gathered of the songs, like, say, for example, in manuscripts, in various manuscripts, different songs by O'Carolyn are there.
He wrote the text?
Yes, he wrote songs, yeah. But many of them are just hagiography, praising the person. But it's fascinating. Ratsa Sheer go Manon, it begins off, I'll head west for Manon, is the beginning of the one for Frances Dillon. I don't know the songs because I never learned them, to be honest with you. But it's a while since I played any of those tunes. They're rather unusual tunes. But the melodeon became prevalent in the 1900s, right? So the result was that you had 2 particular townlands in a Hamor. It was everywhere because it was cheap. They could have one melodeon and you'd pass it around. The 2 chief townlands that had huge numbers of melodeon players in this area were Raith, Rocknagupan, where Seamus O'Duffy is from, the radio presenter and channel singer and fiddle player and so on. And the other townland is Coigulasis, that I mentioned already. And Coigulasis is a very large townland because it's divided into 3 townlands, 3 parts, Coigulasis, north, south and middle. And it also contains the areas of Liscat, and then beside it is Octoboy. And those were citadels of music, like. But melodeon became hugely popular after the pipers were gone.
So basically, melodeon took over the pipers died
a lot.
And then the melodeons took
Yes, and then to make it more interesting, the melodeons were largely in C. So that meant the fiddle player had to go down, and the fiddle player could hardly be heard at all. And it meant also that the flute players were having trouble playing along with the melodeon. But certain flute players then would be in England and they get a C concert flute, which was great, But at one point in the early 1920s, there was between 50 and 60 melodeon players between the townlands of Coigulasis and the townlands of Raith. And Seamus O'Duffy explains that by 1924, 25, and certainly by 1928, you had only 4 melodeon players left in Raith and 6 in Coigulasis. Now, the interesting thing about the melodeon players in Raith and in Coigulasis were that a small number of them managed to survive right down to the present time, almost. Like in Coigulasis, the last of them, Joe Byrne, of the original single row players, Joe Byrne died in his early 60s, maybe about 10 years ago. And in Raith then, the last of them, Ellen Brennan, I'd say, died about maybe 15 years ago as well, and Lizzie Byrne died maybe the same, So it lasted all the way down. But Paddy Joe Tighe then and his mother kept it going on the Coigulasis end, Ballinacostal end of things, and down the other side then Alan Morris Rowe kept it going through the connection of his grandmother. Okay. The tradition here, like the harping tradition, which went back to the 1600s and the early 1700s, went on then to the fiddle and uilleann piping tradition, and that there were 3 uilleann pipers here in the 1800s. The best known of them was a man called Caulfield, and he was just referred to as the Piper Caulfield, and it was only in recent years that with research Michael Kelly discovered his name was Patrick Caulfield, and he died in 1884. But a number of his tunes have come down to us, and it's interesting how they've come down. They've come down through the melodeon playing, because the melodeon more or less became really prominent in the late 1800s, the early 1900s. Now, I did mention how there were blind fiddle players as well, 2 women in particular. Maura Canally was one of them, and the other one was Lyons. But that tradition lasted into the early 1900s, the blind fiddle tradition. but the melodeon gradually began to take over. And we know all the reasons for that. You're more familiar with that history than I am. Because the instruments were very cheap and the instruments were readily available and they could be passed around during the night. And because of all that, women became heavily involved in the playing of the melodeon. And before that, they wouldn't be let near an instrument usually, apart from the fiddle maybe, to a certain extent. But there was, it's fascinating. But just to give an instance of how the melodeon situation might work, if we just take Coigulasis, which was one of the big bastions of the melodeon here, consists of 3 townlands, Coigulasis North, South and Middle, and then beside it are the townlands of Liscat and Kilgarriff. And then across the border in Knock Parish is Octoboy. And that area there was exceedingly rich in musical tradition. That's where 2 of the pipers were in the early 1800s, down into the late 1800s. And the melodeon became very, very popular there. And for instance, there was a family called Mullins who lived beside the school in Coigulasis, which is in Coigulasis Middle. And it's the very next house to the school. It's knocked now, but it was an open house. And they had 2 melodeons there and flutes and whistles all the time on the dresser. And people, Mick Feely, whom I recorded there last year talking about that particular townland, said that at any time of the day you were passing there, a person could go in and take down the melodeon and have a tune. And he said you could hear music coming out of that house at any time. And there were also great singers as well. So that was the kind of the focal place. And of course, going to England was the big thing. People then began to get more sophisticated melodeons and accordions and stuff like that. And the single road tradition stayed right on into the 2000s, of course. But one of the last really great exponents of it, really lovely, lively, hearty player was Joe Byrne. And of course we called him the real Joe Byrne because the other fellow was in Galway and he was famous and he was on television and he was celluloid screen man. And the real Joe Byrne, one of his ambitions was in the 1950s as a young fellow in Leeds to buy a Paolo Soprani. They were really coming into vogue. Now, the Horner had come in the meantime, of course, as you know well, which replaced the old stop melodeon, the Horner accordion. And but the ambition of everyone that was playing was to get this Paolo Soprani. So Joe brought home his Paolo Soprani. But of course, it was an awful weight. And as he said, it was a bit like the front of a tractor, you know. David Brown. It was really big and heavy. And he couldn't steady it and he was so disappointed. So what he did was he got the local shoemaker to put a leather strap at the edge of the Paolo Soprani. So you had this wonderful large instrument and Joe would play the inside row then or the outside row, whichever, depending on how things were going. But he didn't bother with the crossover situation. And it's very sad. I had a lovely plan and Joe Byrne and Galway had agreed to this, that Joe Byrne meets Joe Byrne would happen in Carty's pub in Knock. And incredibly, within 6 months or 4 or 5 months of us talking about that and getting it ready, Joe Byrne and Coigulasis got some sort of a degenerative disease. He was just in his 60s, you know. And he just passed away almost within 9 or 10 months. So he was a great loss. But getting back,
any more characters in this area though, like Coigulasis?
There were plenty of great characters, wonderful characters. We'll stay with the melodeon for the moment. So, Joe Byrne's uncle Mick Byrne was a wonderful character, and he was also a great Shannon style dancer. And he'd sway back and over, and he used to dance on his heels, something that was greatly denigrated and belittled, in later years, because it was wonderful, and. Mick was a very, very lively man, and he was very fond of smoking the woodbine and later on the players, and he'd suck them right to the butt. And Bernie Prendergast Cognan, who's an artist who teaches in Clamars, he's from Clamars, but is married here in Turin in our parish to John Cognan, the hurler. And Bernie Prendergast did a stunning drawing of Mick Byrne, drawing the very last guile or tint out of the cigarette, and the creased face and all that, you know. She also did a wonderful drawing of Kate Nocton, Paddy Joe Tighe's mother. And Mick was a great character, and he was great fun as well. And he would jump up in the middle of a tune, and he'd be moving his hands back and over, and he'd have the fag in the hand and the smoke rising up and sparks of the cigarette, and he'd pouncing around. Prounce oil was the word we used around here from there for prounce all around the kitchen, you know. Great character, and great fun as well, great sense of fun. And then you had Kate Naughton Tig then was from up that area. She was from the town of Ballinacastlo, which is beside Coigulasis, just adjacent to Coigulasis, it's not more parish as well. And there's a fair green there. There was an ancient fair there since the 1500s, and even before that, of course. But the fair green is still there, and it lasted down into the 1950s, and that's why it's called Ballinacastlo. You have Ballinacastlo was the place below that grew into a large town, but our Ballina just, you know, would have maybe 10 or 12 houses in a sort of quadrangle. But Kate Naughton was from Ballinacastlo, and there was a shop in Ballinacastlo called, it was Byrne's shop, Joe Byrne, the same name as myself. But Joe went to America for some years, and then his sister Maggie was there. But the Byrnes used to play the melodeon, and Maggie would also sell the odd melodeon. She'd have a melodeon in the shop to sell, and Kate was pestering her mother to buy the melodeon for a long time. But eventually the mother came back and she had it under her apron as a surprise for them. And I've a lovely account of that in some of the notes and booklets that we've brought out. And Kate was a very interesting player as well. She had some very interesting tunes. And the question we need to ask ourselves is, where were these tunes coming from? Quite a number of the players they'd always have a few in the bag that you wouldn't hear anybody else play. And they didn't come, most of them, from gramophones or anything like that. We discovered eventually that quite a number came from Piper Caulfield. And if we just take 4 in particular from Piper Caulfield, Caulfields were from Tyrone, and they came in the late 1700s to County Mayo. Some of them settled in East Mayo anyway. Some of them settled in Ahmore Parish in Coigulasis, as I said. And you had 5 or 6 families of Caulfields there. And then more of them settled in Kilmavie Parish. And the piper was Patrick Caulfield, whom I mentioned already. He was from the town of Liscat. He lived in a place called Townach, and there were 4 or 5 families of Caulfields there, and they were all into music. And the piper was obviously, you know, had a huge influence at that time. The piper's bush is there, or tree is there. It's still in the settlement. But we'll just take 4 examples of tunes that have come from Piper Caulfield to us. The first one is called the Coigulasis, which is a jig. Straightforward little jig, and a very nice one. And Colin O'Donnell called one day to the school where I was teaching in Coigulasis, and we were practicing that tune, and we had it written on the board, and Colin took it, and he called it the Coigulasis subsequently, and it was brought out in the book that they brought out of some tunes later on. The next tune is a jig also. It's called Nelly Killian's jig, and it's an interesting one. Nelly Killian was a melodeon player from the next town and further over in Ahmore. You had Coigulasis, Ballinacastlo, and then you had Lismegan. And she was a very lively accordion player. But her husband, Jimmy Killian, played the fiddle. And in later years, she kind of didn't play the melodeon much because her melodeon was in the key of C. And of course, the melodeons wouldn't tune either. If a reed went that time, as you know, David, it couldn't be cured. So Neil Killian was in Ballyhorse one night, and there was a big session in Halpin's pub. And the pub was really closed all week. But you'd go in the side door on a Monday night, and you'd knock on the side door, and Jack Halpin would let you in. And you would have musicians there. The session went on for about 25 years. And people would travel from all over, like Dolores Kane and the Matt Kane that come from Clare Strand to it, because people knew this was a great Monday night session. They knew it was a kind of a shutdown now as opposed to a lockdown. It's kind of a lock-in.
Speakeasy.
And he had the license still, but you know, and it was a lovely session. So PJ Hernam was one of the people that used to come there quite a bit. And Maura Staunton learned a good few tunes there when she was teaching in Ballyhonus. But PJ asked Nell Killian to play a few tunes one night, and she played this tune for him. And PJ took it with him, and he calls it Nell Killian's Jig. Others start saying that it's Scatter the Mud, but of course it's a totally different tune to Scatter the Mud. But it's a tune that was really distinctive to this area, and it comes down, of course, from Piper Caulfield. And the interesting thing is that Nell Killian was a descendant of the Caulfields and of Piper Caulfields. And there's another lovely tune as well that comes down from a descendant of Piper Caulfield. There was a man called Tony Morton, who was from the townland of Octoboy, that townland I mentioned that's in the Knock side, where Seamus Egan's people come from, and where Bridget Marley, the great melodeon player who was married to Ed Reevy, came from. And you had a pocket of flute players there as well, the O'Briens and the Lohans. But Tony Morton was from there, and he was an accordion player and a fiddle player, and he was a descendant of Piper Caulfield, and his mother was Caulfield. And he went to America and he had a band over there. But we have a reel called Tony Morton's Reel, and it's a little bit of a cousin of the Greenfields, of the Farewell to Erin, a little bit of a cousin, but it's a lovely distinctive tune in its own right, and there's a great gimp to it. And it came to me through another melodeon player. Tony Morton was gone and was in America, and there was very little talk of him, but another amazing melodeon player, she was called Nora Tolan Rooney. I mentioned her the last day to you. Nora Tolan Rooney was from further over in the parish of Knock. She was in a place called Kilhun, which is on the border with Culchama. And that's the famous townland where Johnny Ivers used to teach dance that I mentioned the last day, Eileen Ivers descended. And that's the townland also where a younger woman, a distant relation of Nora Tolan, Bridget Tolan, was born and reared, and she was the first Mayo person to win an All-Ireland on the double row system. She taught herself, even though she had learned the single row system. But returning to Nora Tolan Rooney, Nora Tolan Rooney went to New York, and she lived in 3 centuries. She was like Dennis Hempson, the harper from Derry. She lived in 3 centuries. She was born in 1898, and she lived to 2002. And she went to America in the early 1900s as a young woman, and she was in New York most of her life until she retired. But she constantly played the melodeon over there. And she had one of these Walters accordions, which she had bought from the German Walter. She actually had the letter from Walters where he repaired it for her some years later. And I published the letter in the little booklet that goes with Busky Shingles project that she did, but featuring 10 single row melodeon style players from East Mayo. But Walters had a row and a half with large buttons on it, and of course there were green shamrocks and everything on it. And Nora was really big into the sessions. She married a man called Barney Rooney from County Down, Nora told him, but they didn't have any family. So Nora would go every Sunday to this particular street. I just can't remember the name of it now. It was written in the book, in the booklet. And sometimes they'd go to the Catskills as well. And they'd have the Saturday night there, and they'd come back into town, as she said, on the Sunday morning, and they'd be all afternoon. And she had that wonderful description of, she said, they'd go down steps to the basement of this pub or centre that they were in, and Irish centre. And she said when the door would open for you to go down, the breeze, cool breeze, would come up. The air would rush up into the hot air of a New York day, and she said you'd hear the reels coming out, ringing down below. And he said your heart would totally lift, and you go down there then, and you might be back at home. You were completely cut off from the city of New York and the skyscrapers and the noise. But she was on the New York Kelly band that came to and competed in the All-Ireland in 1960. There was a wonderful photograph on the front page, I think it was of the Irish Press, and she's there with them. And Paddy O'Brien was the leader of that band, the great Paddy O'Brien, who crossed over the famous style. And they had several other great musicians from New York as well. It was interesting though that they had a melodeon style musician with them. But Nora, of course, had tremendous drive. And of course we should remember too that Sean O'Reilly, for all his complaining about the melodeon and its inadequacies and its sound and its loudness and everything, included a melodeon player, Sonny Brogan, in Kyoto Coolin from the get-go. But getting back to the tune, it was Nora Rooney that gave me the tune. Back to Tony Morton, Tony Morton's Reel. When she was a young girl, she had relatives in Octoboy, this townland on the border of Ahmore and Knock, and she used to come over there, and that's one of the tunes she took with her. Beautiful tune, very lively, gimpy tune. So the last tune we'll pick is even more interesting now. It comes to us from a man called Denny Mulkeen, and the Mulkeen family were all very musical. Seamus died there 2 years ago, and Austin is still alive. He's one of the last of them. Austin, a nice steady melodeon player too. Didn't play for a number of years though for various reasons. But Denny Mulkeen was a great step dancer and a great singer. And lovely neat step dancer, lovely neat feet on him. And he was a good footballer too. And Denny had failed a lot. He was only in his 70s, like in his middle 70s, or maybe late 70s when I recorded him in 1972. He was probably born around, I suppose, 1896 or so. But he was far past his best, even though he had been a lovely, hearty player because of the dance, like Mick Burke, his neighbour. Mick was a bit younger than him. But Denny played this lovely Highland for me, a lovely unusual Highland. And nobody at all would have played it in this community, or nobody in the border in Sligo there, or the border here in Roscommon. So found out anyway that it's a Highland from Tyrone, which is so interesting. Again, one of the tunes that came down from the Caulfields.
And this Caulfield, the Piper Caulfield, would he have composed these tunes, or would they be tunes passed down to him from his people in Tyrone?
I would say that from his descendants in Tyrone. Well, he was born in 1814, so therefore he was probably born here. The first crowd came in the late 1700s,
okay.
So he was a first generation of the Caulfields. But these tunes would have come down with them, of course. In fact, Jerry O'Sullivan, the great New York Mayo Uilleann piper, has a name for this particular Highland. We always call it Denny Mulkeen's. But you jump the country, like you jump across from Leitrim, you jump across Sligo, and you jump down, and the tune appears here. So it's so interesting, just like the Caulfields themselves appeared and brought us these unusual tunes. So that's one instance. Of course, there was another piper in Coigulasis as well, Piper Carney, who I think it died the year of the Great Famine, as far as I remember. That's 1847 or 48. But what I was trying to get across to is those four tunes. Just take those four. Are so interesting. The lovely interesting version of a tune that's called The Buck on the Wood as well. It's a lovely old tune, and Mick Burke would call it John Bange's version. John Bange's tune. John Bange is a flute player from the town of Linenhall, which is just adjacent to Coigulasis as well.
But these tunes, these four tunes you talk about, would they have been composed or for people?
Well, perhaps the Coigulasis was composed in that it has the name and everything.
Yeah.
But I don't know about the others. Okay. I cannot say.
Right.
But the Nell Killian's jig is a wonderful piping style jig and a great melodeon jig too.
And who taught you your tunes?
Well, most of my early tunes came, as I explained to you the last day, from my father. Yeah. And my father's name was Joe Byrne, and he was born in 1895. He was old when he got married, and then I was the youngest in our house. So you have that kind of gap there. He could really, in some respects, have been my grandfather in a way, even though he's a big, tall, very physically fit, hard-working man. Right up to the end, he died in 1980 at the age of 85. But he had, as I mentioned to you the last day, he had a set number of tunes. He never learned any of the newer tunes, and I mean newer, going back to the 1920s. Course, yeah. He just had this set of older tunes that came down.
And local.
Yes, and versions of them that were local, like. And there's about a dozen of them in the nest, of tunes that are very interesting in that respect. And he also was a very good step dancer, as I explained. I went through that the last day. Very neat and tidy step dancer for a tall man. Not the best of that bunch of step dancers. Jim Conboy would have been the best, and Johnny Conneely then would have been the very best, just further over in the parish. And you had others like Tommy Cassidy and that. But the lovely thing that came across in relation to my father was that they enjoyed the music, and they enjoyed the pint, and they enjoyed the drink. When Father Filer, this priest I mentioned to you, used to come from California, we'd have the house sprees in the late 1950s when I was a very small boy, and then into the 1960s up to 1970. And he would have all his neighbours there. And the older men would do what was called a buck set, and 4 of them would go on the floor usually. Now, apparently there had been 8, but they could only muster, they'd only muster about 6 at this stage. But there was one man in particular, he used to dance in Wellingtons that were laced. The laced Wellingtons. Men, you'd see an odd man at mass with those as well. They'd be saving there were Wellingtons that had lacing on them, and they had kind of reinforcing on them. They were a kind of a Wellington boot, if you like. They were quite popular. I'd see 3 or 4 of the older men at Mass with them. But they do a box set. And also then, what in the box set, you see, you had the 4 corners, of course, each man was at the corner, and then they'd join hands and do kind of a side step around. But each time a person would do a step, and if you're anyway handed in, the men who were good would be able to do maybe 3 or 4 or 6 or even 8 steps. So it could go on and on. And there'd be great cheering, of course, and sweat falling off them between the kitchen and between the drink and all that, And my father would have his waistcoat. He'd always have a navy blue suit, and he'd have the jacket taken off and a blue waistcoat. And Jim Conboy the same, whatever. And there was Tommy Cassidy, a very nice step dancer too, and Tommy Barrett, and there were a lot of older people who could do a nice step of dance.
And this was your earlier introduction to this kind of...
Oh, absolutely. It was. I was so fortunate that... usually when Father Fowler came too, he came in the summertime. So that meant that a lot of the musicians were away working seasonally in England at the hay or the harvest or whatever. So therefore, I got a chance as a younger person. Now, all our family played except my sister Killian, and they were all able to knock out a number of tunes on the whistle. We sat on our father's knee when we were small, and he did the fingering, and we did the blowing, and he had it put into our mouth like that. And his father, whom I mentioned already, James Byrne, was a flute player as well. And his father, then my great-grandfather, Dominic Byrne, was a flute player too. So there's this grand sense of tradition going back, And of course, Knock had a flute and drum band as well. The flute and drum bands were very significant. Interestingly enough, there was no actual flute and drum band here in Ahmore, even though there were loads of flute players. But some of them were drawn into the flute band in Kilkelly, because Kilkelly is part of Ahmore Parish, this side of the bridge.
They weren't too strict about show me your passport kind of thing. Yeah?
No,
if you're from the general area.
Exactly, right. That was it. That was it. And they'd sort of play away. And to show you that there was a tradition of that kind of marching, even when you were with the Rand Boys, and a march would be played too for the sets. Paddy Joe Tyke has a lovely story of a march that he calls Tadish Stenson's March. And on New Year's night, a number of the flute players and whistle players would march from where Paddy Joe was born in the townland of Ardra and that area there, Carabon, and they'd go over to the crossroad to the Kappa Cross, which is on the Turin Ballyhonus Charlestown Road. And a tea chest Jimmy Prendergast used to have for the drum. And they'd pray, but this is a lovely unusual tune that Paddy Joe has, you see. It's the St. Stephen's, it's the New Year's one march. It really is a polka, I would say, that was played as a march. And then the other flute players would come the other way, from the other side of the crossroad, of course. They'd come from Huntsfield, which is actually in Kilmavee Parish. But then they'd also come from our own parish, and particularly from Ahatahran. For example, there were 3 brothers there of the Grady's, and they had 3 wonderful flutes. And interestingly enough, those Grady's now are the granduncles of Seamus Egan, the great flute player and banjo player, and American born, but of course taught by Martin Donoghue here in Mayo. They came home, his father came home to work in the industry here, and they returned later to America. But it's fascinating, so that there wasn't a flute band to my knowledge per se, but it's so interesting that we have that connection. And they're heading for Kappa Cross, and the Frains there near Kappa Cross. Jimmy Frain was a very good flute player too, it's just part of the story. But returning to my own story again, to our own story here in the house, the next thing that happened then is my father didn't teach us any steps of dance at all. A teacher came called Seamus Ford, who was from the parish of Bacon, Reesk, a place called Reesk. Seamus's mother actually was Byrne as well, but a very distant relation of ours. But Seamus was one of the official teachers, who belonged to one branch of the dancing Cumann Kinnahere, and I cannot say which branch. They were split in 2, as you know. There were two distinct groups. And there was an awful of aggro at one level, and yet there was great competition. But Seamus was a very fine step dancer, and he had learned from a man called William Flatley in his own parish in Bacon. And William was a very neat, very tidy dancer, and of all things he was known as the Ferret Flatley. You know, I mean, these names were priceless.
Unbelievable.
Yeah. But Seamus was a very fine teacher, and Seamus was teaching dance here in the hall in Hamore in the early 1950s. The hall was built around 1951. And my sisters learned to dance, and they're very handy dancers, the three of them. Really, really handy. And they had a special uniform as well, and they had a green broth with the harp on it and all that kind of thing, and dancing dresses and all that. And they were really, really handy at it. And it should be remarked too that that's where the Byrne sisters in Derrymore, the mother and aunts of Jean Butler, learned their dance as well, from Seamus Ford. They lived in the parish of Derrymore, which is in the parish of Bacon, actually. The next parish to us here, where Seamus Ford was actually from. And Seamus had a feis every year as well, all through from the late 1940s down into the 1970s. Held it in a field, hail, rain or snow. They would go into the community centre if they were stuck, but it was a lovely thing. And Seamus was teaching dance right into the 1980s. He passed away there some years ago. So that was the dancing in the house, and my mother, my sisters would always dance, and it was a lovely thing. And if there was a concert or anything in the hall here, they danced at that, and a play would be done, and there'd be a little concert beforehand, and then travelling shows used to come all through the 1960s here, and they would have a little concert, and they'd have local people involved as themselves. Most of them were musicians too that came, and they would have the music. So it was a lovely kind of a scenario. And then there's another element to dancing as well, which is very interesting, very, very interesting too. That one of the great friends of my father was a man who lived in the village. His name was Michael Harden. Now, Michael was a small man, a lovely, lovely man, very warm character. And he was married to a lady called Kate Harkin. And Kate had inherited the place, and she was really in charge. She wore the breeches, and Kate was a very smart woman in many ways, but very traditional. And of course, they had no family. So Michael would strike out to our house, because our house was very near the road. It was the old house over there, it was gable to the road, and people would be dropping in and out all the time. But he was a great flute player, and he was from a place called Coigulasis, which is really right under the airport now, where the airport is. The airport isn't in Knock, it's called Knock Airport, but it's 4 or 5 miles from Knock. It's behind Kilkelly, if you like, in the direction of Charlestown. And he was from there, and there was a huge number of flute players there, something like, I think, 24, 25 flute players in that townland alone. And the next townland to that then was a little bit further over where Alamores Rose people are from, and that was the fiddle playing. Killathurley was the fiddle playing townland. And again, you'd have 18 or 20 fiddle players in that townland. So you had a whole nest of those people, of those musicians, like, if you like. It's citadels of fiddle playing and citadels of flute playing. But Michael Harden was a very interesting man, and he was a very fine musician, but he was also a great step dancer. And he was one of the last of the older men who wore clogs constantly. He wore clogs all the time. And you'd hear him coming when he'd be coming visiting. I'd hear him, and he'd have the flute within in his inside his jacket pocket. And he'd shout to my father to get the flute ready, and they'd have a tune. And straight away they'd start playing, but he would be rushing, an awful rush to get into our house, because he believed that music was largely wasted if it wasn't played for dancers. Mm-hmm. So he would rush to try and get in before my sisters were in bed. And they would dance. He'd get them, each of them to dance, and he'd get them to make the step that they had learned that week as well. And he'd jump up then himself, and he'd flake out a reel or a hornpipe or a jig with the clogs. And he'd sit down again, not a bother on him. And sometimes if my sisters were in bed, they mightn't be long in bed, he'd be a little bit late for one reason or another, he'd persuade my mother to get them up just for the dance, you know. And he was a great fan of neatness in dancing, even though he didn't have the same steps that Seamus Ford had. He loved the Seamus Ford's neat dancing, particularly the double jig that he had, and the hornpipe. He really enjoyed those. But he himself was a great man to dance a reel. But just to give you an indication of how those pockets that I've mentioned, I'd like to internationalise this now, right? And to show you how beautiful it is. All the places that I've mentioned, and we'll start with Michael Harden. He was from Coigulasis, that townland that's right down the plains. You're looking up at the airport. And in fact, the airport is built on the hill bog. It wasn't wet bog at all, it was just hill bog. Very dry actually, and it's rock. So of course that was all bunkum about it being a bog, you know. But his banks of turf are you're landing on his banks of turf. But there was a great tradition of music there. And there are two great musicians at the moment who are promoting the music. And one of them won the Mary Robinson International Award in Australia. And he's a man called Doherty, who had the shop right beside Kilgarriff where Michael Harden was from. Younger man than Michael Harden. Sean Doherty is his name. And Sean was a very handy fiddle player, and his father before him. Even though he was close to the flute area, but they had a fine two-storey house and a great shop. But in the early 1960s, very early 1960s, Sean had a significant family, and he could see that the business was fading fast. Immigration was, closing up a lot of houses, and families were smaller and so on. So he took a venture and went to Australia. Absolutely just went to Australia with his whole family. Now, two branches to this story. Sean went to Australia, and he went out to the western part of Australia, to Perth. And there was very little music activity or anything there. Sean, with a number of others, set up Irish music group, set up branch of Coigulasis, and became an astoundingly successful fiddle teacher, a great fiddle player, great strong fiddle player. Very comprehensive too, plays beautiful slow airs as well. Wouldn't be in any camp. He wouldn't be in the camp of playing like the Sligo fellas, or he wouldn't be in the camp of trying to play like from the radio of Seamus Connolly or anything, but really rhythmic, strong, good fiddle player. And his latest protégés back there 7 or 8 years ago, he had a settlement of Chinese and Korean people who were winning All Irelands, coming from his classes in Western Australia. And Sean was ultimately given the International Award by Mary Robinson. It was lovely, a Mayo woman giving him the award as well. And it was so richly deserved. But even more, I suppose, unusual is the little twist in the story. His youngest, one of his daughters who went to Australia, didn't really settle there. She always was longing for home, for Kilkelly and for Charlestown and for Kilgarriff and all that. And her name is Fiona. And Fiona eventually came back on a holiday and with them, and she decided to try and stay on. And Fiona Doherty, his daughter, she's a fine fiddle player as well. And Fiona, the house had been closed up for many, many years, the old shop and all that. So Fiona went to live with her aunt down in, with her granddad, down in Sligo. She had married down from Charlestown down in Sligo. So Fiona inherited her farm. So Fiona lives down there now as one of the leading teachers all across that part of western Sligo, a portion here of East Mayo and northwest Roscommon. And she's a really wonderful musician, beautiful fiddle player, and has a gift of teaching, an amazing gift of teaching. So that's just to give one international story. So I started with Michael Harden. Now, the thing I should have said about Michael Harden was Michael Harden had a gift which no musician around here, my father certainly didn't have it. Michael Harden could hear a tune on the radio, and they didn't have a radio, but he'd be in the pub, or he'd hear it coming out of the pub, because his little house was up a Porsche, as we say. A Porsche is the word we have here, not for a Porsche car, but for a laneway. And he could hear the Cayley house would be on a Saturday night, or Killian Mhaigh Eo, and he could hear a tune, and he needed to hear it a second time. He would have the tune in his head, and he would be able to bring it out a bit. But if he heard it again the second time, he had it, and he would write to my father to say, "This is a tune now I picked up from the radio." And if Michael Harden was there for 100 years, my father wouldn't be able to learn it like that. Neither would I. But it was just this facility I'm talking about music. And if we return just to that area for a moment, just to take ourselves aside to that area for a moment down there was a flute and drum band down, the Killian flute and drum band down there, and tremendous tradition of music in that area. And that was superseded to some extent by the accordion, melodeon style. And that's where Alan Morris Rowe is from. He's from Coigulasis, just at the back of the airport on the other side. And Alan Morris Rowe is probably the greatest living person who has knowledge of melodeon and melodeon music now, and who has vast recordings and has a huge collection of 78s. I think he has almost every single 78 of traditional Irish music that was ever recorded in America. And he also was influenced. His father was a lovely accordion player, really, really sweet, lively accordion player. Joe, he died about a year ago. And Joe's mother was a wonderful melodeon player, Nelly Gallagher, and she was the source again for maybe 20 tunes or more and unusual versions of tunes, maybe 30, that Alan learned from her when he was a small boy. They were sleeping together, as far as I know, in the Hague bed, if I remember rightly. And it's a beautiful story again in that. So Alan Morris Rowe now undoubtedly is one of the leading. Yeah. But what's interesting then is you just jump to the next parish again for the melodeon, and you find the Conlon family. You're in Swinford still, and you're near Clongulon Bridge. And the Conlon family were there, and there was a large family of 9 or 10 or whatever. And of course, subsequently their son, P.J. Conlon, the famous Peter Conlon, became this phenomenal musician in America. He was born, of course, near Milltown. They had got a little bit of land in a little house there in a landlord's place. But they were from, the father and mother were both from Swinford, and that was the music that was played under their roof, as Alan Morris Rowe said. And their father was actually a dance teacher as well, just to give you an idea how Conlon had this tremendous drive for dance. Their father was an actual dance teacher. And even after they went to Galway, he went to Ballina every winter to teach step dance there. And it's quite well recorded, you know. So the mother was a great melodeon player too as well, fiddle player. So just this is to internationalise. So we're just still in that triangle there. We have Alan Morris Rowe and that segment of it. And we have P.J. Conlon's family in the next one. And there's Sean Doherty, you know. And then there's Fiona Doherty. But it would be unfair and not right and not correct to just highlight those people, because they are just, if you like, the international representatives of this glorious tradition. And there's always doubt being cast. Well, I mean, how good were they? And what, you know, people will be asking, well, I wonder now, were they as good as they said? And maybe they just did a few extra tunes and people thought they were great and all this kind of thing. Whereas that's completely missing the point. And I want to go back to piping now. And this has nothing at all to do with Armagh, but if we just take piping as an example, one of the great dynasties of pipers were the Kearneys of South Mayo. You had Kearney pipers near Culchama, you had the Kearney pipers in Coigulasis and in Knock, but the others were down near Irishtown, right? And they were Michael Kelly has traced, I think it's 7 of them now. But it was said that in 1879, when the Land League meeting was held in Irishtown, that the warming up was done by the 3 Kearneys, 3 generations of the Kearneys piping. Now, I don't think that is quite accurate, but in any event, they did the warming up. And one of those then, Michael Kearney, who was born, Michael Kearney would have been about 8 or 9 years of age when the Land League was founded. So Michael was not piping there that day, but, or hardly, he hardly was, so he might have been. But What's so intriguing about this now is that it has 2 or 3 very neat twists in it. First of all, Michael Kearney, do you want to change the...
No, please go on.
Michael Kearney belonged to a dynasty of pipers, which is incredible, uncles and everything. And also, later on then, melodeon players came into the picture.
Same family.
Accordion style. But Michael went to America as a relatively young man, and he was in New York, and he was making great success over there. He worked very, very hard, and he was also piping. But he got injured, and he spent several decades of his life in a chair. He had damaged his back. He was working apparently on the underground under the Hudson River. But Michael Kearney made 1 or 2 recordings on 78s. And he played with James Morrison. and they're playing together, and they're more or less playing the same style together, and it's wonderful, open music. It's very like Patsy Toohey, right? And that was the fashion. Patsy Toohey was the showman, he was the man. But what came to light later then was there were cylindrical recordings of Carney, you see. Now, Patsy Toohey wasn't a piper when he went to America, and he didn't come from a piping dynasty. I think he may have played the flute, I'm not sure, but he was from Dunsandle in Galway. But I don't want to talk about that because I don't know much about him. But in the case of Carney, he belonged, as I said, to at least 3 generations of pipers. So the thing is, Carney was here in America, and he was playing, and he was a great friend of Patsy Toohey, but he was playing the way that was expected at the time.
Which was the
Toohey style. When the cylinder recordings emerged, it was discovered that Carney was the most unbelievable tight piper. Extraordinary is the word, and it can't be used lightly. Just beyond belief. And it's interesting that there was a Connemara man, whose father was from Leitrim, Sean McKiernan, who discovered those recordings, and he befriended Annie Carney, the niece of Michael Carney. And when Patsy Toohey died, Michael Carney that inherited his pipes, because the mantle was passed on to Carney. But Carney, of course, was brilliant at that style of piping, the piping that Toohey, because he was doing that. But this other stuff was unimaginably good. And we have a beautiful situation now where the wheel has come full circle, all right? And there's a fellow called McGowan, who was a Mayo Dublin piper. His people are from Newport, the Hobans of Newport, the famous Republican people of Newport. Dan Hoban is his grandfather. And McGowan has been studying the old recordings of Carney. And the First of Spring, for example, is one of the tunes that he plays like. And McGowan is trying to do Carney on this. And it's just beyond belief what he's doing. That's just one show.
Are they commercially available?
Not at the moment, no. McGowan has gone on a scholarship to America.
Okay.
He was secretary there in the Piper Stuff for a couple of years, which gave him a great chance to be researching on it. But when I get a chance, I can give you some of his stuff. Yeah. But that's very beautiful. But it also brings in another thing into mind about Carney. Michael Carney was in America, and he had many different pupils. One of his most famous pupils is a man called Tom Busby, whose people were from Monaghan. And Busby was married to Annie Carney, Carney's niece. But there were 3 piping brothers in from northwest country, was common here. The 3 Lavin brothers, Jim and Peck and what we call them, and everyone would assume, and I would myself, that they belong to that glorious piping tradition of West Roscommon. Because that pocket of West Roscommon there, and this pocket here of East Mayo, would have had more pipers per parish than any other parish in Ireland. Any other parishes in Ireland. The Roscommon segment and the Mayo one. But no.
And you're just talking kilometres away.
That's all, yeah. Actually, our parish touches that parish there, just down below Turin. But what's fascinating is that the 3 Carneys, one of them went to America, and he learned from Michael Carney, you see, the Mayo piper, and he came home and he taught the other 2 brothers to play the pipes. But you would have thought that they were directly coming down from the great pipers in Roscommon, the famous Johnny Gorman, who won a prize at the Erasmus in 1904 and so on. But not the case. Yes, and it's so interesting that he did. And what's lovely about it is that they managed to keep up that tradition. But there's a further turn to that story as well, which is even more beautiful. What is more interesting again is that the actual pipes that he brought home from America were made by Michael Carney. So Michael Carney made pipes as well. So I just happened to be over at Jim Lavin, a great friend of mine, a wonderful character. And Jim was coming in after milking the cows, and we were having a tune, and I was recording some stuff from him nice and quietly, when a big knock comes to the door, And it was a man, he said, God, he said, I've been trying to find where your house is all day, for the last hour, and I found you at last. And Jim said, oh, come on in. And who was it but Sean McKiernan? And Sean McKiernan arrived, I just happened to be there by a fluke. He arrived outside Castlereagh, to Cahir outside Castlereagh, to Jim Lavin's house. And he wanted to play on Kearney's pipes, because he was a great friend, as I mentioned already, of Anna Kearney and of Tom Busby. And he had been researching Michael Kearney, and he had found those wonderful things. But he said, I have a treat for you. He said, I have Patsy Toohey's pipes for you to play now. Because they were left to Kearney, you see, Patsy Toohey's pipes. So Jim Lavin put on Patsy Toohey's pipes, and I just had the tape recorder, which was great. And Sean McKiernan put on. And he said, Kearney only made 3 or 4 sets. So McKiernan went examining them up and down everywhere, and the reeds that were in them and the whole thing. And the good things about them and the flaws in them. And it was...
But the fact that those a set of pipes from... And Toohey didn't make pipes.
No.
It was a set of pipes played by Toohey, and a set of pipes made by Kearney in the one house.
Yeah, and when Toohey died, he left Kearney the pipes. You see, Kearney inherited his pipes. So again, you're internationalising. Now you might say, then how did the Lavins end up beyond in Castlereagh? Well, the Lavins were from right a few houses from where Piper Gorman was from, in Gortigani, just on the Amor Gortigani border, Loughlin border there. But they got a farm, the grandfather got a farm over in the lands outside Castlereagh, when the farms were divided, and that's how he ended up in Cahir outside Castlereagh. So, like,
there's an awful lot of history.
There are, but the stories are very, very beautiful. Like.
But what about we'll talk about you for a minute now. So you went on to college, I take it. You left home.
Yes, I went to secondary school then. I was in a Hamor school, and I never played a tune there. You didn't play a tune in primary school much at that time, and nobody did. And that's the way that it was. We sang in the choir and that kind of stuff, you know.
Wow.
And then I went to Ballyhornis to St Patrick's College, which was only open 3 or 4 years at the time. And it was a day school. I cycled in and out for the first couple of years until the bus came. The bus was introduced, free transport was introduced. But in Ballyhornis, you didn't play a tune either there in the secondary school, even though we had wonderful teachers, and we had one or two of them were really interested in local history and folklore and all that, and Irish language and everything. But the Ceoil didn't really feature. In fact, I don't believe there ever was a traditional musician, apart from Don Morton, whose people were from Hamor, that lived in Ballyhornis town. I don't think there was ever a traditional musician actually living in that town. And the same would be applied to quite a number of towns. But that's not to say that the hinterland wasn't very rich in music. But to return to that, you asked me a question and I didn't answer it as usual, of course, I went rattling around. But we used to go to Trumicady, to the convent, to Coigulasis and Trumicady, for a day every year. It was a tremendous drive because of the scenery and Loch Corrib and Loch Mask and all that. But we used to go up there because there was a debating, there was a Gaelin set of debates, and we'd have a warmer-upper there with the girls. And of course it was a great excitement because there was a whole load of girls in it, and we were a boys' school. So we'd have a great old time in it, and a great crack as well. But I'd always be asked to bring the flute on those occasions. But I wouldn't be playing it at all in Ballyhornis, ever, in the secondary school. But I'd be asked to play it on those occasions in Coigulasis. And it always went down really well. And the girls would do dances. They'd have been learning to the tape recorder, but they'd do the flowers of the walls of Limerick, and they do the fairy reel and all that kind of stuff. And invariably a girl or two would do nice step dancing. So I must say I enjoyed that, and I found it very refreshing.
And how did you keep up the playing if you weren't playing in school and college? Like, did you play in the house?
Well, playing in the house, as I mentioned already. Yeah. And as I said, the significance of Father Follett was colossal. Yeah. In coming home every year for the holiday, spending a month at home and having a massive spree that went on all night until morning on the first Sunday night he came home and on the last Sunday before he left. And that was huge because you played every tune you knew, and sometimes you might have to play them maybe 2 or 3 times, depending on. And some people would only dance, say, for example, the Boys of Blue Hill. So you might have to play that hornpipe, maybe. Yes. And then again, even if there were other musicians there, then my father wouldn't bother playing any tunes that he didn't know, or he wouldn't pretend he was playing. He wouldn't bother, said he'd just play what he knew himself. And the versions of tunes he had to do, of quite a number of his tunes, were totally different to what others had. But almost invariably at some point, someone would arrive in to play at the spree. They'd be coming from the pub or wherever. So I remember one particular night, a man called Pat Gilday. I had never met him before. He had been playing with the Birmingham Kelly band in England. He's from outside Ballyhorn, a place called Grawn. And his brother-in-law, Paddy Lyons, a fiddle player, they both arrived in coming from Coigulasis. And I remember joining them for a few extra tunes that I had known. I'd learned them somewhere myself. And I was able to join in with them. My father was right. He was having a bit of a chat with one of the neighbours or whatever, and of course he was talking to Father Filer as well, and he was in good shape, you know, after having Father Filer would have a barrel of each drink and so on, even though he never drank or smoked himself. But I remember that particular one, and then I remember hearing Paddy Joe Tighe at one of those concerts for the first time as well. I had one of those sprees, house sprees. And then it's interesting how things can strike you. There was one large concert in Ahamore where the Coigulasis musicians were invited on stage, and there must have been about 8 or 9 melodeon players, recording players on stage that night. And they played for maybe about 20 minutes or stuff, and I couldn't get over it. Like, there was no amplification, of course, at those concerts, so therefore the volume that they made was unbelievable. And there was Joe Burke and Mick Burke and Tim Meach and Animal Downey, and you know, it was magnificent. Denny Mulkeen and Austin Mulkeen.
In the same style of music.
Oh, absolutely. It was mind-blowing. And they played tunes that my father didn't play at all. And tunes that I hadn't heard on the radio either. Like, we'd always be listening to the radio to the job of journey work. And to, even though we'd be in the fields, we'd all come in to hear this. And similarly then on Saturday nights, Kelly House. So they had an enormous impact on us in that respect. Like, we wouldn't, as I said, I'd be slow enough to learn a tune, but you'd enjoy that kind of thing.
And can you recall like some of the most enjoyable memories of listening? Because for myself as well, like growing up, like the first time I heard the Dannon, for instance, and just been blown away by these 3 lads know what they're doing, and they sound so good together, and they're creating this lovely sound, and they're passing on the legacy of the 1920s and 30s and the early recorded music. Have you any of the memories where you heard someone on Kelly House or Job of Johnny Work and said, that's what I want to do?
Yeah, I have some memories. I didn't develop that properly. I went kind of sideways again there, but laterally. But I have, for instance, I remember the first time that Fred Finn and Peter Horn came on the radio. It'd be about 1961 or 2, I'd say. Or it mightn't be the very first time, but they played the Clavel Jig. In fact, there was no name for that jig, and they called it the Clavel Jig. I found that out later. And I thought it was beautiful music, lovely and sweet, and very, very interesting. I remember also being at a concert over here in Ahamore Hall. Every year there was at least one major gala concert in Ahamore Hall to try and keep it going. And there was a man called Tom Costello, who was from Ahamore here, and who went to live in Dublin. And he became owner in some cases and manager in others of about 14 different ballrooms, both in Dublin and across the country. He founded the Television Club in Dublin, which was one of the ballrooms of the day there, the Top Hat and the Unlera and all those. And Tom Costello was a promoter for show bands and for musicians as well. But he was also very much involved in sideways with Gaelin too. So I remember Tom Costello bringing down very famous acts from Dublin for this concert. And the first time I ever saw a Nillen pipes was Leo Rossum on stage in Ahamore. I don't know, it would be maybe 1960. I can't say what year it was. I was a small boy and I had to go home, I remember, before he played the second time. But I couldn't get over, again, the sound he was making and also the complexity of the instrument and of the tunes, you know.
And there were different tunes to what you knew at this point.
Oh yeah, very different. And he wasn't sparing it, like. I'd say he had a few pints, and he was after coming down by car, people brought him down and so on. And the same night there was a man there called Eric Benson. Now Eric Benson was a very well-known musician. He used to play for all the dancers on Dinjo that show that was on the radio, where they'd be dancing on the radio. Incredibly, then Joe used to do all the major dances, the Sweets of May and all the different dances. That one or two of them would be taught by Rory O'Connor. Rory O'Connor was the famous step dancer of the time. He was a great friend, by the way, of Seamus Ford that I mentioned, who was teaching my sisters, and of Flatley and Ballyhonus. They were best friends. Rory O'Connor, in fact, was the best man. Flatley was the best man at Rory O'Connor's wedding in Dublin. But Rory O'Connor used to be teaching this on the radio. It's advance, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, retire, step back. And Eric Benson was providing the music. Right, yeah. So I had never seen a piano accordion before until I saw Eric Benson. Wow. And Eric Benson also did a lot of accompaniment. And there was a lady who was very famous at the time. She's called Peggy Dell, the O'Dells. And she used to do cabarets and that in Dublin. And she's singing Irish and in English. And she was singing at the hall. And I remember I was really impressed too with the huge melodeon, like the front of a tractor again. The huge accordion, and you just asked me for seminal moments, like, and I'll come to records now in a second. But that was very, very instructive. And another time when the Flagpole was in Swinford again, to be 1961, and I was a small boy, and I remember a carload of musicians arriving from Dublin and going into our house. They were on their way to the Fleadh, and it was Tom Boyle from down the village that brought them to us. Brought them in to our place, and he wanted to borrow one of my father's flutes for one of the musicians that were down from Dublin with them had sat on the flute when they got out of the pub in Roscommon. They drank in every tongue coming down, of course, and broke his own flute. So my father lent it to him, no problem, for the Fleadh. But they were playing in the house, and there were 3 flute players among them, and I can't remember any of their names now, But again, very interesting. I think one of them was O'Connor. Very, very, very interesting musicians, And again, they played tunes that I didn't know. And they played kind of piping tunes. And I'll come back to that in a second. So that was the first time I heard really, really loud live music in the house. There was one fiddle player with them as well. I don't know was it Paddy McIlvanney or not, whose daughter were great fiddle players afterwards. I think it could have been. But Tom Boyle had brought them down, and there was 5 passengers in the car and himself. But that's the first time I heard a piano accordion again, because there was no television and you didn't see it. You didn't see it. So later on, then Dermot O'Brien in the middle 1960s, around 1966, became extremely popular with his. He was a great footballer too. He was the captain of the Louth team in 1955 that won their last All-Ireland. And he had a big hit in 1966 called We're Off to Dublin in the Green and the Green. Of course, 1966 was the 50th anniversary of... But the 50th anniversary came along then of 1916, and we went to see Mhaigh Eo in the cinema in Ballyhonus, and we're blown away by it. Like the whole idea of Russian do, and it was arranged so well. I'd heard a cousin of mine singing it. I had a cousin called Nori Ninieri, who was from just over the road here, Dugara, and her father was a very good flute player, a big man, mountain of a man, who used to play regularly with my father, Mick Nary. But she was sang all the time with the RTE Orchestra, and she sang every Sunday night on the radio with the RELO show. Now, she sang classical music, like German music and stuff like German songs and all that. But she also sang in the Irish language. She was a very fluent Irish speaker. And she sang loads of different songs. But I had heard her singing Róisín Dubh on the radio before that, right? And the next thing I heard it in 1966 with your man, with the cinema. And I couldn't get over it. And even the other pieces that were in that as well sounded magnificent. The orchestra.
It was orchestrated.
Yeah, it was wonderful. Yeah. And I didn't know at the time, but he was hugely influenced by Sibelius, the Finlandian fellow, who was big into liberation as well in his music. But using that kind of... And when I was young as well, maybe around that age, around 1966, 67 as well, I remember there was a program on the radio, that on the television at that stage, that had a piece of Sibelius as its signature, and I recognised straight away as being the same carry on, you know.
Kind of sensationalism.
Yeah. And it coming at you.
Yeah, kind of angry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Proving a point.
Yeah.
But then you're a man well known for your love of general folklore as well.
Yeah.
We can finish talking about the music. Sorry, but
yeah.
Do you have any more to talk about the music?
Oh well, the music was hugely important. Like in that, I didn't come on yet at all. I don't want to keep you much longer now because I want to do a few things myself.
No, of course.
Just to develop another bit in. I remember then Gaelin had a programme on the Saturday afternoon. Now the Walton programme was on Saturday. And we always listened to that. But the Walton programme was never satisfactory as far as my father was concerned, or indeed myself. It was lighter kind of music, you know. Hard to, like the Donal Ring Kelly band would be on it, you know. And they'd all start off like the Scottish Jimmy Shand band. And it went on like that. And you had a lovely singer, Charlie McGee. And his guitar was one of the ones that was on it. He was a Donegal fella, and he'd be singing about the Crawley doll and that, you know. And you know, there was Jerry Burns then. Jerry Burns was from County Down, I think, and he'd be singing Patrick Sheehan, but he'd have like accordion music with it. Now he had quite a pleasant voice, and Eileen Donaghy was big in it. Her sons later then were great footballers, such her owners, her grandsons. And like she had songs like The Flower of Maharali and all that, but they were all kind of arranged like that. And Brendan O'Dowda was big at that time. Kind of a semi sort of a tenor, you know, and he'd be singing the songs of Percy French, like, "Are you right there, Michael? Are you right?" This kind of thing. You know, and Michael O'Duffy, who was the father of Johnny Logan. That's what was going on there, you know. And the Ballad of Sweet Marie as well, this horse that fell and all that. So it was that kind of thing, you know. But the first time that I found there was something new coming in, incredibly, was Johnny Cash, when he brought out 40 Shades of Green. And it's hard to believe he was singing in an American accent and everything, but there was something new and refreshing about that. And the same with the I Live in Innisfree that Bing Crosby used to sing. You knew that it was neat, but you knew it wasn't exactly the full story, but it was neat.
It was neat in the sense of well arranged and well put together.
Yeah, and there was lovely melody in it.
And great singing.
Lovely melody in it, you know. So you kind of knew that. Yeah. But the next thing along comes the Gaelin label, and they start bringing out. They were the first to bring out recordings per se, almost the first anyway. And Jeannie, it was amazing. Like for example, you know, they recorded, say, the likes of Nicholas Tobin from, you know, this massive person from there's only 2/3 of a parish in the Gaeltacht in Waterford, but yet people like Tobin in that kept those 2/3 of a parish going, and it grew around them. They were the patriarchs of it, and you'd hear Tobin like, and he'd be singing Shlíomh na Mán or whatever. And you get a shiver up your spine. Like, he had a huge voice. He was a fisherman and a farmer, and a big man, you know, and had this incredible presence. Subsequently, not that long after, in 1971 or 2, I heard him at the Oireachtas when we used to put on a show. Seosamh McGowan and Kilmavee would get the Hamor crowd and the Kilmavee crowd to join together, and we won the cabaret a few times, the Scoriocht at the Oireachtas. For winning, it wasn't an important thing, but we had a lovely show, like, and I remember seeing him in the flesh. That should be, you know, about 6 years later, say, in 1970, 71, 72. And I couldn't get over him as well. Couldn't absolutely get over him, you know. But that was hugely influential. And Gaelin also brought out some great recordings of Paddy Canny and that crowd from East Clare as well, who had a tremendous... And then just not long after that, the Outlook label came out in the north. Mm-hmm. Some amazing stuff came out of that, like absolutely amazing stuff came out of it. And you know, Sean Maguire and Roger Sherlock would have been the first great duet that I realised like that. You don't have to be, you know, they were from two different parts of the country altogether, but it made an amazing duet.
You didn't have to come from the same.
Yeah, you had a Mayo man and an Antrim man together, you know, and it was just magnificent, like that's you weren't pocketing it. But in terms of regions, I suppose the most regional music that hit me like an absolute train was when Julia Murphy and her brother Dennis recorded The Star Above the Garter. Oh, Jesus, like, polkas had been belittled so much before that. But when you got them in the hands of strong fiddle players, like, who had a ring and who knew what they were doing.
They're from that music.
The Slieve Luthra country, you know, and the reels that they had. Now I know that Pádraig Ó Cuíf was their mentor, and he was the Nicholas Tobin of that era. He was this massive
music,
and he was able to write music, and he used to write the notes in the Bank of Turf for them. Imagine, isn't that a stunning story, you know? They have a tune called the Bank of Turf. We used to write it for them. So therefore, that was massive, like. So I wasn't, like, the bands didn't really start to come in. You're a lot younger than I am, right? So that means that, you know, the bands really didn't come to the fore until Sean O'Reilly brought Ceoil Mhaigh Eo on. And they were there all through the early 1960s, 1962, 63, 64. And they had the Bowron introduced in a big way. And there'd be a solo bit on the fiddle, and Paddy Maloney was a lovely sweet piper. He was easy to listen to and had great dexterity and a lovely variety of tunes, and he knew how to arrange a tune even when he was with O'Reilly. But I'd say that the first time that I really was blown away by Ceoil Mhaigh Eo was when I heard them playing the Lament for Limerick on the O'Reilly Sagaithi, and I could not believe it. It was such a simple tune at one level, but it was there all the time. Little did I realise, like, that it had come down itself in the Battle of Aughrim, and those the beautiful Battle of Aughrim that they did had come from Piper Riley, who was from Clonfad, just across the border from us here in County Mayo. And Piper Riley was brought up to Dublin, brought up to Belfast to teach the McPeaks by Joseph Bigger, one of the nationalists, and the tune came back down then. So I did not realise that the Battle of Aughrim and the Ayr and the March were one of the favourites of Riley. And people saying Riley is from Dunmore. Of course, Riley went to live in Dunmore later in the town, but he's from Clonfad. This extraordinary pocket I'm talking about of pipers that I mentioned earlier, Roscommon.
From here.
And Roscommon, he's in that pocket of Roscommon is unbelievable for music, right? It's absolutely stunning. Piper Burke, the amazing piper in New York, was from there as well.
So you were saying O'Reilly brought this music up to the Lake.
That's right. Yeah.
So it came
so
from him.
I heard them at Peaks then, and they were the first persons that I heard ever playing with pipes and harp and singing, and I couldn't get over it. Like, they were singing the Singing Bird, and they were doing O Rosh the Bahawalya, and they were exactly the same combination almost that Plank still later brought on. It was the same thing, but the McPeaks that were doing the job with it. Whereas Sean O'Reilly had a fella called Sean O'Shea, whom, you know, was a very, what you would call a very straight singer, you know, very high pitched tenor, and you know, he had a big hit like with the Pucker Bulla, which was a bit of fun, but it was very hard to listen to a lot, you know. Fine man, and that, you know, and but he had Dara Cahan first singing with him.
Amazing.
That was different, and Dara Cahan was amazing, but Dara, of course, you know, had different things, and then he went to England and didn't come back, and that sort of thing.
I didn't know that.
But
he never came home.
not for ages. No. Dara, he was from Connemara originally, but they went to Meath, and they got the farm there, and they were working there, and the displacement didn't help Dara either. But he had a great way of going on, you know. So, like, it's hard to believe that it was all happening there in the 60s. It was really, really all happening, you know. So anyway, by the time I'm trying to remember. By the time anyway I got to Dublin, to the training college, there was lovely sense of the music coming into its own at that stage. Right.
What years was this?
I was in the training college from 1968 to 1970. I was born in 1951, so I'm 69 years of age now, right? So that meant I was just in time for that glorious time in Dublin. So to start with, in the training college itself, there was a lovely box player from Cork. Donald Lynchy was his name. And there was a grand flute player in my own year then from Wexford, Eddie Mooney. And I started going up and down to Wexford. And I found there was great pocket musicians there, the Gorey Kelly Band and the Bunclody Kelly Band, Tim Flood on the banjo and Jerry Ford on the fiddle, and lovely people as well, very relaxed, uncomplicated people. Like one of the greatest hurlers in the college was Shawnee Kinsella as well, very quiet man, you know, not a bit like the southern counties or any player else, you know. Really, I loved I loved those people there. And of course they had a glorious tradition of music down there, like over the years. And then getting back to the training, because PJ Hernan was in my time in the training college as well, and PJ was a man who was unbelievable, and PJ brought a total discipline to the thing. PJ had a notebook, a copybook in his room. We all had separate rooms that time. We were so lucky. The college had been only built, the new college had been only built like 4 or 5 years at the time. And PJ had all the tunes that he knew, all the reels that he knew, and the ones that were to be practiced, and he had the master risks, and he was an amazing man.
Wow.
But he was a great man to play with. I played coming home one Christmas with PJ on the train, and I forgot to get out in Athlone and make my change. I went on to Galway, yeah. Yeah, he was magnificent to play with, you know. He was a pleasure to play with, yeah. Really lovely man to play with. And PJ loved music, and of course he loved the Gaeilge too, so we had a great time. You know, really, really great time. And then there was Micheál Kitt, the TD, was an excellent accordion player too. He had been, so many of those were taught by the Mulhairs. Mulhairs had an enormous impact, like we were talking about Pádraig O'Keefe earlier, like we're talking about Sean Doherty over in Perth. You know, a gifted musician can impart so much. If they are. So Micheál Kitt was in college with me too. He was a TD for many years in South Galway and North Galway. Micheál, his nephew now, Kitt is the famous pop singer. But Micheál Kitt was a great guitar player as well. And Princess Hogan as well, you know, who played later with Paddy Carty and all those. Marvellous guitar picker, bass and all that. So you learned an awful lot from these fellas. Like Princess Hogan played along with PJ Hernan too, to an extent as well. And you had a few others in the training college too. You had a fellow called Con Herbert, a great hurler too from Limerick. And again, very understated, you know. So we were so fortunate that this was the case there, but then going out to town was even better. We had a free pass every night in the week to the Irish Club. So the Irish Club had a different Cayley band every single night in the week. And usually on the Sunday night they'd have the Kilfenora, or they'd have the Bridge Cayley band. You had a whole list of them. It was magnificent. And you'd have then the in-between bands, the bands like Brendan Shine that would play loads for Cayley and loads for... So we'd go at least 3 nights a week to that, because it was free. We hadn't a penny, you know. It wasn't a halfpenny of any kind at that stage. As you know, David, yourself, well, you were too young, but like, currency was just not available. That was the bottom line in it. We had a farm here. My father tilled the land, sowed oats, potatoes and turnips and vegetables, sold them in the marketplace. We had a small milk run in the village here. We had 8 or 9 customers. So therefore he never went to England. So we were dependent entirely on the bit of land.
But was living cheaper? Like the train? You got the train up and down?
Yeah,
was that
very dear. The train was mad dear that time, yeah. Really? And to go to England, sure, the Lord saves, you'd have to spend about £500 to go on a plane to England, like, you know. It would be a whole year's wages to go to England, yeah. Yeah, sure, it's the craziest thing ever. But sure, both fortunate were trying to get people to come back on holidays here from England, and Aer Lingus were blocking them from coming by the prices they were charged. Sure, it was scandalous. But we won't go into the politics of that. If we stay in Dublin for a minute, so then that was one side. I loved going to the Irish Club. Great fun in it. We were never home in time for the bus. Like, so we would walk home, then you'd be walking home, maybe 10 or 12 of us, and there was a set number of people. So it's interesting that one of the great set dance teachers in the country was in college with me as well, in the training college, Pat Murphy. And Pat is from Tipperary, and he would be the best known teacher of set dances in the whole country. Connie, what you call him, and him would be the 2 big ones that everyone would know. So Patty would be in the Irish Club 5 and 6 nights a week. But Patty would be home with us, and he was a nice accordion player. And he'd be humming an old tune that he might have heard me. And I remember seeing Kieran Kelly playing it. Oh God, I can hear him going down on that beautiful jig that he played. Kieran Kelly, I only saw him twice now in the Irish Club, but he was from Athlone. He was a magnificent accordion player. And he has taught some very fine musicians as well there. And he had a lovely array of tunes. He had those tunes that went right down. And there were other bands as well as that, like, but I just mentioned just a few of them. The northern bands were excellent, like Johnny Pickering and his band. Johnny Pickering was a lovely fiddle player from Tyrone, and he had a really, really nice band. He had a good number of bands like that. The Don't Ring Kelly band, of course, from Cork was the big one for that kind of Kelly dancing and stuff. But I remember then that was the Irish stuff. So that was very enriching in that, you know, I wasn't a great dancer there, but you'd always be out for the Siege of Venice, you'd have a great old crack, and there'd be an old waltz played, and then you might hear a reel that you hadn't heard before in the course of the night. Maybe just one was there, maybe a jig it might be, you know. And you say, God, that's a grand tune, and you'd hear it somewhere else again then. So that was very enriching. But also, where did we go to the sessions? Well, the sessions were incredible. Really, they were unbelievable. First of all, you could go into Donoghue's any evening in Donoghue's, any evening, particularly Friday and Saturday and Sunday. And sitting inside the door every single Friday, Saturday and Sunday evening in the corner was John Kelly and Joe Ryan. You know, Joe Ryan came down from Drogheda. He had been from Clare too, but they got land up in Louth with the Land Commission. And John Kelly's was from right here in West Clare, and he had a shop in Capel Street. You know, so they were there, and they would be making great music. Now, there were the sort of players you wouldn't join them in a session, and you wouldn't want to, like. No. You'd enjoy that, and you'd love that, and you'd be there maybe because they were there early. And I never forget Joe Ryan. He never drank anything except pint bottles of Guinness. And boy, could he consume amounts of it. Not in any way, and he would never betray the slightest stagger or the slightest.
He could handle it.
He wasn't a big man, but he was wide. Broad and wide. But they used to play lovely stuff. I remember learning a few of the hornpipes that they play by listening to them, you know, really love listening to them. Then there was another great session in Slattery's pub in Capel Street. And Slattery's pub again was divided into different parts. But I could only go to Slattery's the odd time because you had to pay to go in. So therefore we couldn't afford. But when I started teaching then in 1970, it was great. You could afford to go in. And they had a downstairs session, and it was magnificent. It was there I heard Tony McMahon first, and an unbelievable night there with Seamus Ennis as well. He was playing in it, and others as well. That's where I heard the Press Gang first, Sean Corcoran and that crowd, you know, men singing like that. It was, and it was all happening. This was great. Like this was just like like if you had arrived and you were eating and drinking music, you know, it's like manna.
It was all the time.
Everywhere. Then the Coigulasis sessions, there was a great one out there was a great one down in the hotel there. Oh my God, my memory. It's just there off Morton's Hotel. It was in the corner of Gardner Street.
All right. Yeah.
A really great session. And we go in there, and the Clontarf branch of Coigulasis used to come in there on the Saturday night. So you'd have John Regan, who was in the Clontarf branch, but he was a box player from Sligo, a lovely man. He worked in the post office. And Paddy Glacken, and Mary Corcoran, a wonderful piano player and whistle player. And Denny, the great old-hearted Denny, you know, his family. I met them later. I taught them in Irish. That around that very same time, I met them the following summer. I used to teach in Letchermore in the summer college just for a month. I did that for 4 or 5 years. In the summertime, the O'Briens, Denny O'Brien, you know Donogh O'Brien, the great uilleann piper, and Donogh was the great whistle player who was in the wheelchair, and Micheál O'Brien, Mick his brother, and they would, Denny, their father, would be there, and. I remember one night, for example, who came in with Cathal McConnell. And what I found refreshing about Cathal McConnell was he was the first musician I had ever seen out like that in sessions who didn't want cueness, he didn't want accompaniment, and he just considered himself, he was an excellent flute player, he was a very, very fine whistle player, and a great singer. And he'd sing, and the next time he'd play the whistle, and the next time he'd play the flute. He was so rounded in his approach, and then he'd tell a yarn to start off like, and he'd pull the piss out of whatever was going on at the time, like. And he was
great
like
entertainer, but also just music to him.
He was like a breath of fresh air, and he was also so comical. He had kind of a largish nose and the glasses on him. And he was even going bald at that stage. He was a relatively young man. He was going around, and you would hear him, but not in a loud, abrasive manner, but in a very clear way. He was brilliant. Oh,
you mentioned an awful lot of characters.
Yeah, but I didn't want to mention famous people. I hate doing that, but I wanted to give you the context. Context. We'd go the odd time then to the Piper's Club, but not that much. We'd go to the Piper's Club. It was a great scene, and I couldn't get over all the fine young musicians that were there. I mentioned the two McAvaney sisters, that long brown hair that they were like film stars, It was great to see these women flaking out fiddles on the fiddles,
If I to narrow it down to one more question, and the question I'm going to ask you now is a very kind of an abstract question. With all that you're after telling me, going up to college, remembering your early memories of the boys dancing and your father and everything, what does it mean to you to say that you're from Mayo?
Oh, well, being from Mayo is a great part of this story, because it's a quintessential part of it. And the first thing to be said is that at one level it's not very wise to geographically or sociologically or historically to talk about counties, because counties were imposed upon us by the administrative system in England. It was primarily to collect taxes and all that. It was for reasons like that. It had nothing at all to do with cultural. So the result is, like, if you take the Slieve Luachra area, people say it's in Kerry, but of course the other part of it is in Cork. And Dan O'Connell's famous pub there, and the dancers are all on the Cork side. But we shouldn't say all, but so that's the same region, right?
So the boundary didn't matter.
Boundaries don't really matter in that respect. And what you have regions. You have maybe river valley regions, or it could be anything. But the counties, certainly, quite a number of them are very artificial indeed. Now, Mayo is a huge county, so therefore you could have 4 counties made out of Mayo. You could put Louth, would fit within an Erris alone, County Louth. So, and Carlow as well would fit into Cross. So, having said that, while that is the case, it has become compartmentalised, not through my doing or anything else, but because of exposure from leading musicians. Starting off particularly with the leading musicians who recorded in America, who were influential. That is to say, 3 Sligo fiddle players in particular, Coleman, Morrison and Killian. That it became known as the Sligo style, right? And that was hugely popular because the fiddle was the most instrument that was listened to. Records of melodeon players, recordings of flute players, pipes and all that, never hit that zenith. Wow. So therefore, they had an enormous impact, and understandably so, because they were excellent musicians and they were great at doing their thing. But if you like, that's how we began talking about Sligo style, all right? Mm-hmm. But the question we ask ourselves is, where did this Sligo style come from? And of course, the clear answer is that it came from the pipers. There was a piper, all right, in Sligo, Piper Anderson, but the acknowledgement of the likes of Morrison and those, that a load of the stuff that he had came from Piper Gorman, who of course was from County Roscommon. So straight away you're running into a difficulty here, as you can see, by saying that there's a border, because the chief influence on Sligo music was the Roscommon Piper. And no wonder, because I'd mentioned to you already that the Roscommon Pipers were outstanding. I cannot say how many pipers there were in Sligo because there don't appear to have been very many, but I don't know. Maybe some researcher will come up and find them. But the main counties for piping were Mayo, that portion of Roscommon, Galway and Kerry. They were the big piping counties.
Kerry for counties?
They were the big piping counties, right? So if we just think of that for a moment and say, has this been mentioned before? And the answer is no. So therefore you realise straight away that you're not talking any kind of equal description here, but you can understand the scenario. Now, if you take the flute playing tradition, and again they talk about the South Sligo style of flute playing, but really the main influence on flute playing for a long time was the Leitrim man, John McKenna. So again, straight away you're out geographically if you're demarcating by using a county. You're out by the side of it,
So would it be more correct to use the phrase region then?
Well, regions is the word. But if you just hold for a second now, you can say for example, if you take what would you distinguish then? Donegal, yes. You'd associate Donegal with fiddle playing, a certain type of fiddle playing, long bow, but bareness, great rhythm, great driving rhythm, akin to music from Scotland, all these kind of things. It would be identifiable. But there was hardly any mention, of course, of Sligo music at all, because it was overshadowed for decades and decades until the Dohertys were brought into prominence by Killian and subsequently by people like Paddy Glacken and others, and Mackay, that wonderful man in Donegal, that tradition became recognised. The other people would rubbish it and say they hadn't half the turns that the Sligo musicians had and all that kind of stuff. So then the next thing you turn into Clare. Oh yeah, County Clare is identified with this, and you'd say to yourself, they'd be all talking about Garrett Barry, the piper, and all that. But if you scratch down, how many Garrett Barrys were there? Like, I'm after explaining, but it doesn't matter. Like that's a lovely thing that they have to talk about him, and it's important, very, very important. But it happened then that Ciara McMahon, who was from Limerick, had a penchant for Clare music. His wife was from East Galway, and he began getting a penchant for that. And he also was very partial to Slieve Lochra country. Not so much turning towards Donegal or, inland counties like Roscommon or places like that. So he sort of, if you like, he was about 40 years or 45 on the radio, and he kind of built it all around that for the vast majority of that time, like.
Kind of mythical in a way.
Well, yes, and he, to an extent it was understandably so, but it went down that, that those were the counties. So you ask yourself then, what about counties like Limerick, where he was actually from himself, like. Limerick has a glorious tradition of music. And P.W. Joyce, the collector, look, he did them great service and mentioned so many musicians, pipers and so on. What about Waterford, like, which has tremendous tradition of music as well, What about Wexford, which has an incredible...
Why do you think these counties aren't mentioned then?
Well, I'm after explaining that it was the recording process primarily that brought them to the fore, that brought a lot of these counties to the fore. Subsequently then, it was the various footage that was given and airtime on radio, mainly on radio, that was given. And those were the barometers that were used, and that is fine. That is perfect. There's nothing wrong with that at all. So, if you turn back then, if you actually want to draw a line and talk about Mayo music, which is what some people want to do, and that's how they categorise it, you search around and you find, so where does Mayo music stand in all this? Well, Mayo music has an enormous standing in, but for various reasons, that tradition hasn't been explored. It certainly hasn't been publicised, and it has largely been unacknowledged. And you just think, how did this come about? Well, it's hard to credit, but it's actually still happening at the moment, even as we speak now. And let's just give a few examples to go into the past. If we take fiddle playing, like just take fiddle playing, which is a contentious matter. One of the greatest fiddle players that O'Neill said he heard was John McFadden from Newport. Now, not only was John McFadden a great fiddle player, but he was an extraordinary composer of tunes. And the poor man got dementia when he was older, and he was learning some of his own tunes back again. So we only have a limited idea. We believe that 40 of the most famous tunes that we know of are attributed to him. But, there was McFadden's number 1 and number 2 and number 3, and McFadden's Handsome Daughter, and The Pleasures of Hope, and, the Westport Chorus, and all these tunes that we know. But they were never mentioned in the context of County Mayo. In fact, loads of people began to think that McFadden was from Donegal, and others said he was from Monaghan. That was a Monaghan name, So how that can come about is hard to credit, even though in his book he says that McFadden was from County Mayo, and he was, so that is very difficult to figure. But fair enough, That was the situation, right? That was the situation in Chicago. That's difficult to figure now, right? But it doesn't matter that it isn't said. He still is and stands today as an exceptional musician. But now we're actually saying he's from County Mayo. But that's only an addendum. That's fine. We'll move on now. We'll just stay in Chicago for a moment. By far and away the most influential and amazing piper in the last century, in the 1900s, was a man called Joe Shannon, who was born in Cultchimagh, between Cultchimagh and Bohola. And Joe Shannon said at one stage that there was more music in the Bohola, Cultchimagh, Swinford area when he was growing up than there was in all of Chicago, right? And Joe Shannon was, for various reasons, he played in the 1932 fair, right? World Fair in Chicago as a young man. And there was two other musicians with him. Three musicians played at the World Fair. And the three musicians were Eleanor Kane Neary, the famous piano player, whose people were from Hollymount, right? Johnny McGreevy, whose people were from Ballintubber, right? And Joe Shannon.
Three males.
Right. Was there ever any mention at any point? No, we heard that Johnny McGreevy's mother was from Connemara, which is correct. Was from Connemara, indeed. We never heard it mentioned that his father was from Ballintubber. Eleanor Kane Neary was married to Jimmy Neary from Swinford, who was a very influential musician in America. But Eleanor Kane's people were from Bushfield in Hollymount, and her mother was a great melodeon and concertina player. But she was the very first person to record music on piano. She was doing Micheál O'Sullivan and playing the hardest of tunes back then. Micheál O'Sullivan never acknowledged or mentioned her in his talks that I could hear of. I never heard of anybody who knew about her. Yet everyone that went to Chicago visited her, but the word Mayo was never used. I'm not saying that it should have been. All I'm saying now is that we know now. But all it is it's just a lovely addendum on to what we know already. Her legacy lasts and will stand. She was the pioneer of the piano in it. Who were the pioneers in the melodeon? Well, P.J. Conlon. Well, first of all, the very first person ever to record on the melodeon, ever to record any Irish music on a commercial recording, was the man with the wonderful German name, who of course was reared down in Brafey in Ballina. And just even to listen to his recordings, the very first ones that he did, for example, there's a jig that's called now the Kesh jig, and of course Kesh is down in Sligo. But this man recorded it, and the lovely version he has of it, the lovely Ballina version of it is just beautiful, right? And that's the very first record. These are the pioneer men of any music, of traditional music done, was done by this Mayo fella. The next one then was Peter Conlon. And Peter Conlon's father and mother, melodeon players, fiddle players, step dancers, the whole lot, from the heartland of the melodeon place. Is it any wonder Alan Morris Rowe is from that country now? See, it doesn't. But was there ever any mention of that P.J. Conlon's music? No. P.J. Conlon was from Milltown, they said, in County Galway. He was indeed from Milltown in County Galway. He was from between Milltown and Ballandine in County Galway. But they had only moved in there, and he and his sister happened to be born there. The other 8 members of the family were all born in Mayo. But again, does it really matter? P.J. Conlon still stands as one of the most extraordinary musicians. Yeah. And all you do now is you have a little bit of correction, and you just put down County Mayo into the equation. You can even say Galway if you want, but you say County Mayo into the equation. So it's fascinating, isn't it?
It is fascinating.
Yeah. And then if you take the likes of John McGrath, who was over in America, and John McGrath was, of course, luckily a few cylindrical recordings have survived of John McFadden. But of course they don't do them justice, but it's great that they do exist, that they exist. Same cylindrical recordings survived from John McGrath as well, because people were making out some people wondered did he exist at all. But John McGrath composed all these extraordinary tunes, and it was quite extraordinary how it was only when the real Stór Ceoil came to the fore. McGrath was an Irish speaker, but he never used Irish in America. He was in the melting pot, and he used the music, if you like, as an antidote and as a substitute for the language. And the only tune he gave that was that 3-part reel, which is a stunning reel. And of course it's called after the mountain behind his house. Sion is a fairy hill. And Stór Ceoil Mhaigh Eo, the fairy hill in the mist. It has nothing to do with John in the mist or Jack in the mist or anything. That nonsense.
It was just misinterpreted.
So Stór Ceoil Mhaigh Eo became one of the leading tunes for competition in the 1960s. Everyone was playing it in the competition. All Ireland's were won by Tom McHale. Played it. He won the All Ireland with it. Same way McFadden's tunes became the leading fiddle tunes all through the 60s and 70s because they were the most difficult and complex. Was there ever mention that any of those? No. So, fair enough. The next thing then, John McGrath, we discovered, John McGrath taught Kathleen Collins, we discovered, Joe Burke's first wife, and taught her brother Daniel Collins, who founded Shanachie Records in America. And when we heard Kathleen Collins, straight away we knew, oh, this isn't Doon Coleman. This is a much shorter, clippier, neater bow like this. And luckily she made one excellent recording. But because she was so interested in learning new tunes and all that kind of stuff, she recorded and was back in Galway at the time. She picked some of those beautiful, difficult tunes of the Fahies and people down there. But still you can hear the McGrath bowing, yeah. Completely. I'm not a fiddle player, and I won't start using much to describe, but anybody, all you have to do is listen to it and you'll realise straight away what I'm talking about.
It isn't Sligo, it isn't Coleman and Morrison.
It isn't Coleman, it isn't Clare. But we're not saying what it is. What we are saying is that John McGrath's legacy stands in its own right. And all you have to do now is a little revision, do a little bit of homework, and put in County Mayo there. You know. And you move along then and you find the same story. The first banjo player in America, one of the very first traditional music banjo players in America, down to South America. The first guitar CD that was brought out with reels and jigs in it exclusively was Dick Gaughan, right? Coppers and brass. Before Paul Brady and before... Is there ever any mention of it? No, not a mention. Or Archie McLean. You know, it's just hard to credit. But what I love about the traditional musicians of Mayo is that they are so lucky not to be hidebound by any great recording artist. If a great recording artist had recorded, that person would have hogged the whole thing. But if you consider now, like say one of the most delicious and succinct whistle players you could imagine, like, is Vinnie Kilduff from Knock, right? Absolutely pristine, right? Now, Vinnie Kilduff's people, half of them come from Octoboy, that I mentioned, next door to where Seamus Egan's people are from, next door to where Ed Reilly's wife is from. You get it now? Just down the road from Piper Coffey's, just down the road from Piper Carney's. And Vinnie Kilduff, an excellent piper as well. He hasn't played the pipe for some time. He played with General Humbert years ago when he was a young lad. But just think of that, like, and just go back then and switch back and think again. Just say to yourself, the World Fair in 1932 in Chicago. Now, come along to Riverdance. The lead dancer, Michael Flatley, the lead male dancer, the 1920s, his grandfather left Kilmavie, went to live in Sligo, right? The lead female dancer, Jane Butler, her mother from Derrymore, one of the Burns of Derrymore, right? The lead fiddle player with them, Eileen Ivers. 60 years between them, right? And 3 Mayo people again. But would there be any mention that Eileen Ivers was a Mayo New York fiddle player? No. But if she'd be a Sligo New York fiddle player. And nothing wrong with that at all. But all we need now is, again, do a little bit of revision and let's get our...
Retype.
Just get our thing right. And you just go on and you go round like that and you say to yourself, well, now I just want to take yourself. It is no accident at all that you are one of the leading exponents of the melodeon style of music in this country, coming from the county that you come from. And if you just think of the man who was in a wheelchair all his life, who was going on his hands and knees for years, Martin Donohoe, and he was made Mayo Man of the Year way back, and he founded the Disabled Drivers Association, all those things. And he taught 14 different instruments. And he taught Seamus Egan, imagine. Imagine Martin Donohoe taught Father Peter Gannon, the great box player and concertina player who has taught so many more in South Mayo. Imagine the Martin Dunne who taught John Kilkenny in Castlebar, right?
Who's teaching?
A melodeon player at heart. Composed all his tunes on the melodeon, beautiful tunes. And you come into Mayo and you have this massive melodeon on the side of the road. You came down by it today, like this stunning, and the jaws of it there. You know, the power of it and everything is there. The primary colours for the teachers, for children and everything. And your man down below in Ballintrubber that made it and created it. One of his first big pieces of sculpture. And he plays melodeon himself. His family are musicians. He lives in Castlebar. And his grandmother out in Ballintrubber, a melodeon player. He grew up with the melodeon in his ears, like.